Hi guys, welcome to Drum Dog, and today we are talking about snare drum tuning. Now, as a drummer, the importance of tuning can never be underestimated because no one likes playing drums that just sound a little bit crap. But it's not quite like tuning other instruments. We can't just clip a tuner on and it says, nope, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit lower, perfect, you've tuned it. It can be a bit of a dark art in that sense because we might be after different tones from one drum. We're not after a specific correct pitch. So it can be very difficult to find that tone that we've got in our heads and get the drums sounding right in the first place. Now obviously there are loads of different approaches to tuning because there isn't just one correct way to do it that gets you to the correct result. So today we're going to be checking out my personal approach to tuning, how I like to get my drums sounding the way I like them to sound. That may be different to how you like to tune your drums and how you like your drums to sound, but hopefully a few tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way will help you guys getting your drums sounding that little bit fresher. Now, before we kick off, it's really important that we actually understand what it is we're trying to do here. I mean, obviously we're trying to tune the drum, but more than that, we're trying to get this drum head stretched over this drum shell with this drum hoop, right? So the hoop is pushing down on the head to stretch it over the shell. Simple. Now the challenge comes in where we haven't just got one thing pushing that hoop down. We have, in this case, got 10 different tension rods pushing this hoop down. That's where things get tricky because we've got to balance the tension across those 10 different tension lugs to get it to push down evenly. Because if we push too hard one way, we're going to have all the tension over one side of the drum and not an equal amount of tension over the other side, choking out that head and not giving us the full sound and resonance that we're looking for. So it is super important that the whole way through this whole process, we keep all of our adjustments nice and even across all of those lugs to get this head seated evenly. So on to the tuning and the head fitting. Now, if you've ever got any drum sound issues, I find the best place to start where we undo any previous mistakes and any previous issues is right here with a bare drum shell. So here's one I prepared earlier. This is my Tama Starclassic copper snare. It's a 14 by 5.5 inch shell and it uses die cast hoops and a 10 lug design. Here it is with nothing on it except the shell and hardware. So this is going to be our starting place today. Now first things first, I'm going to sit that down gently on my snare stand and I'm going to grab my batter head. Today we're using a Remo Ambassador coated head, so just kind of vanilla snare sound we're after today. Nothing snazzy, nothing extra dampened. And I'm going to sit it on the shell. I'm just going to do a quick check here to make sure it's sat on that shell nice and evenly because we don't want it to be pushed over one way. Then I'm going to grab my hoop and sit it on top of it. Now again, before I even put any tension lugs in this, I'm just going to run my finger around the lip of that hoop and I'm feeling for the gap between the bearing edge of the shell and the hoop. Because it's quite easy as you sit that hoop on to get it pushed over one side and you've got a really big gap this side and a really small gap the other side. So again, that's going to produce that situation where with an even tension across all those lugs, we're still pulling this side down a lot more because we're not seated evenly on top of that head. So as we're sitting this hoop down, we're just going to run those fingers around opposite ends of the hoop, make sure he's in there happy, and that's seated pretty centrally. Now that is a check that you're going to see me do a few times through this head fitting until we have some tension on the head. So next step, tension rods. Now, if you're a little bit OCD like me, now is the time to get your head lined up where you want the logo to be. For me, nothing's worse than just a head that's just thrown on there and the logo ends up wherever it ends up. So I always like to pop mine between those two front and center lugs right there. And he is looking pretty good. That makes absolutely no difference to sound whatsoever, but it just looks nice. And now all I'm going to do, after another check on that central seating, you'll notice, I'm going to grab my drum key And I'm going to run these tension rods down. Now I'm not going to even run them down until they're touching it, because this is the most crucial stage to getting this head seated nice and flat. It's really easy to, at this point, accidentally pull this hoop over to one side, and it's not all that obvious when it happens. So I hope you guys can see there, I'm just running these down where there's still a gap. It isn't quite running home yet. I just want to get all of these lugs super close, and then I'll do them up finger tight. Now I am doing this in a star pattern, which I'm sure you've heard in other tuning videos maybe, where we start at one position, then instead of just going round in a circle, I'm going to the opposite, and then back one over, and then opposite, and then back one over, and then opposite, so on until you've done them all. Now this stage does absolutely not have to be done in a star pattern because I'm putting no tension on the head at all, but it's just a force of habit. But it's a good habit to get into, I guess, because we do want to use that star pattern later down the line. So do keep that in mind. So here we have all our lugs run down, so they're still loose. Really, that hoop currently has no tension on it at all. And now what I'm going to do after another central seated check, and this is the important one because after this we're not going to be able to adjust that hoop relative to our shell. He is feeling pretty good. Now do remember when you're running that check that not all hoops are perfectly round, so some bits will feel tighter than others. We just are making sure that the size is the same on opposites. So although the hoop may be ever so slightly oval shaped, it will be the same gap on both sides. Sometimes that gap will be smaller than at other points, but we're just feeling that it's an even gap on opposite sides of that hoop. And now I'm going to actually do this up finger tight. So this is why I really like keys that have this little knurled part on the top, because you get a much finer feel for tension. When we're on these outer wings, it's easy to actually put too much tension on it when we don't mean to. But for this finger tight part, I'm only going to use that little knurled part at the top because I'm not going to be able to put much tension on that at all. So I'm going to start over here, and this is when we are going to start using our star pattern. So to keep an eye on my star pattern, what I tend to do is just put, after I've done it up, put my finger on that lug, that way I can remember. Then I'm going to go to the opposite, and I'm just going to tweak it up until I feel the tension rod touch the hoop, and that's all I want. And then one over, tweak them up until I feel it hit the hoop, one over, same again. And again, I'm just using that knurled part, so I'm not putting any tension on these at all. They're just touching home. So there is still going to be zero tension on this head. We're just making sure he's seated really nice and evenly. And then as I come to my last opposite, I end up next to where I started, and that is my last one. So now those are all finger tight. My head is seated nice and centrally. This is our starting position. This is where the tuning actually begins. But we've given ourselves a massive advantage by having that head seated centrally, nice and even, finger tight all round. We've got our ground zero. Okay, so from here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give each lug, again in a star pattern, a half turn, and we're going to see where that gets us. So a half turn there, and some of these have just backed off a finger tight a bit, just as the other parts of the hoop have gone up. So you'll see me just tweaking them up again until I feel them hit home, and then give it a half turn. So a little tweak up, finger tight, half turn, little tweak up, half turn, little tweak, half turn, little tweak, half turn. And there we go. So that's a half turn on all our lugs, and this is where we start getting our ears involved. So there's not much tension on this head at all at the moment. Kind of sounds like a low-tuned timbale. And what we're going to do is check that we actually have an even tension across those lugs, because there's a high chance that we haven't. We can't just do this whole thing on, well, there's a half turn and they were finger tight, so it must be the same. Let's double check. Now, what I use to double check is a little ear end of my drum key tapped about ½ an inch out on the head next to that lug, just like that. But with the overtones that we get in a head, especially a low tuned one, I find it a lot easier to isolate the localized tone if we use a single finger lightly sat in the center of the head. What's really important with that dampening finger is that we don't put any tension on it, because if we put any force with that finger, check out what happens. Especially that this head's low tuned, it's very easy to actually bend the pitch of that head. So we're quite literally resting just the weight of that one finger in the center of the head, just to kill some of those overtones and get a nice sense of what that sounds like. And as I'm tapping around these lugs, I'm listening for pitch differences between one and the next one. So I'm just going to keep moving around these guys and giving them little tweaks and adjustments until I feel that we've got the same pitch across all 10 of those lugs. Now sometimes you'll find that a particular lug is giving you a bit of a hard time and that it sounds lower than another one, but you've tweaked it up and it's still not quite going where it wants to go, and it feels like you've already put too much tension on it and it's just not getting there quick enough. Then in that case, check the lug that is opposite, because opposite lugs affect each other quite a lot, and you'll find that one low lug over here can cause you havoc over this side of the drum. So if it doesn't feel right, check the opposite and then move forwards. Okay, so there we go. We've got all of those lugs roughly even around that head, and because for each adjustment I've been bringing them up, we've ended up at a nice half sensible pitch. So with that as our starting point for the batter head, let's turn our attention to the resonant head. Now, resonant heads are the same theory, but there's a couple differences. Today we are using a Remo Ambassador snare side, and the first thing you'll notice with a snare side head is they are phenomenally thin. Just in the air, they sound like paper. There is absolutely nothing to these heads, so treat them with care. They dent very easily, so don't be leaning them up against things or putting anything on them, because it will dent the head, which we don't want. So I'm going to be seating this guy here. And straight away, the first things we've got to be thinking about here are our wires. Okay, where do we want our wires to be running? This head has been used on this snare before and it's got an old wire mark there, so I'm going to run that wire in the same position so we don't mark the head up in a different place. The next thing I'm going to grab is my hoop. Now, classic snare tuning mistake. When you get your resonant side hoop, check for the snare wire recesses, because we've all done it before, and if someone says they haven't, you're lying or you just haven't made the mistake yet of getting a resonant head tuned perfectly and the snare wire recess does not line up with the throw off. So check now before the hoop goes on. There's my two recesses, there's my throw off on my butt end. I'm happy that that is where the hoop goes, because it's a real pain when you get it on perfect, all tuned up, and then you realize that you've got to start again because the recess is not in the right place. So I'm going to run through exactly the same process here of getting this head seated and getting it finger tight. So let's do it. Okay, so there's our tension rods wound down, so they're still loose. So let's check for alignment, just the same as we did on the top head. And then we're gonna gently nip them up finger tight. Again, star pattern. Now more so than with the top head, We've got to be very delicate here because this head is so much thinner. It's harder to feel when you're actually applying tension because it can stretch so easily. It is easy to overstretch these. So go real steady, have a nice sensitive feel on that drum key and get a good feel for when those tension rods are touching that hoop. And I can already see that I've got some wrinkles this side of the head, which tells me I've gone a little bit more than finger tight somewhere. So I'm just going to back off a couple before we put too much tension on here. I can feel a couple of these are quite tight. Well, not tight, just a little tighter than I want them to be at this particular stage. And then once I'm happy that we are finger tight, we're gonna add some tension. Same as before, I'm gonna give this a half turn plus, so finger tight plus a half turn, and we use that as our starting point. Okay, there we go. That is finger tight plus a half turn. And this is the point where we start having to take into account some of the differences between the top and the bottom of the snare drum. Because on the bottom of a snare, we have snare beds, okay? If you haven't heard of them before, they are recesses in the bearing edge, where the bearing edge actually dips away from the head to allow for the wires to come over and still be in contact with the head across the center tension surface. So in those areas, we're going to experience a slightly lower pitch on these 4 lugs. Now I'm not talking a dramatically lower pitch, but a slightly lower pitch than the other 6 across these areas next to those throw off and butt end for the wires, because the actual bearing edge of the shell is dipping away and therefore giving it less tension. Now, resist the temptation to crank those up and make them match the others, because then we're going to end up with this higher tension across that area when all we actually want is an even tension across the whole head and the snare bed just to do their natural thing to let those wires work their magic. So as I check across this, I'm going to bear in mind that I can expect a slightly lower pitch on those 4 lugs. And straight away, even at this very low tensioned sound, I can hear that we've got that lower tuning on those 4. So I'm going to bring this guy up a bit more because he's relatively even, and we'll see where we end up. Just a quarter turn this time. Still using our star pattern. Okay, brilliant. So we've got a kind of an even tuning. Now here is where comes in the personal preference side to tuning. So we've got him seated evenly with an even tension. Now for the way I like my snares to respond, I like to crank this bottom head to absolute high hell. We're gonna crank it to get a really nice snappy and sensitive snare response. So in my opinion, you really can't tension these high enough. I mean, you can, because they'll break eventually, I guess. Something will give up. But there's something about a really cranked bottom head on a snare drum that just gives the snares those sensitive response that I really like out of a snare. So again, I'm checking for evenness after every adjustment. And I think I'm going to take this up just a little bit more again. Just a little bit. So it's just one more quarter. Right, now that's cranked, I'm happy with that. I'm going to pop my wires back on. Now if you guys are unfamiliar with the wire alignment process, I have already done a tutorial on that, so you can check that video out in the description. But for today, I'm just going to grab my wires and pop them on my little quick release straps thanks to the guys at Pure Sound. I think it's a genius design, well done. And for the purpose of today's video, we're not going to be worried about snare alignment. Although it is crucial to your snare sound, so if you're not comfortable getting these guys aligned 100%, definitely take the time to check out that video and get it sorted, because it can generate some real issues if they're not perfectly symmetrical when tensioned. Now, although it looks fiddly getting these locking pins back in, it's far preferable to aligning the wires from scratch. So, there we go. Bottom head tuned, wires aligned. Let's flip them back over. And at this point, I think I'm just going to play it and see what we got. So, although I like my bottom head to be absolutely cranked, the top head is where I can get my adjustment. I can get my usable tuning range out of that top head and get the different tones that I want out of the snare. So at the moment we're tuned pretty low because I haven't given that top head a whole lot of tension. So let's get him sat in our stand, there we go, and yeah, that's pretty low down. So I'm going to play this. I'm going to have a pot of moon gel at the ready because although we've got an even tension on a lively copper shell like this with just a single ply head, a low tuning, this is going to be pretty lively. So don't be afraid to crack out the dampening. I don't buy into the myth that good tuning doesn't need dampening. Sometimes if you don't want that ring, the best way to get rid of it is to dampen it. There's no real replacement. You can't tune that out. So let's hear it and take it from there. A really nice starting point. I'm happy with that. We've got a nice amount of ring there, but I'd say it sounds pretty good for a medium-low tuning. So he is a little bit lively there. Let's try him with a moon gel, see how it responds. So just one little gel just in that upper corner there. See what it does. And again, that's why I really love cranking that bottom head, because even with a relatively low tuning like that, you can still whisper at this snare and it whispers back. That little response there. Just that high tuning up there lets those wires respond really quickly because it's under that high tension. So, like I was saying, with that top head, we've now got quite a good usable tuning range with quite ease of tuning. So again, my star pattern, if I give this top head just a quarter tune up now, that's going to give us straight away quite a dramatically different sound in that tuning range. Once you've got that happy basic sound, it's relatively easy to make these adjustments and still be in a good sounding range. See, now I've started playing it, I am starting to see certain lugs, especially around that rim shot area, dipping a bit, so do keep checking. So now with that extra tension there, we're straight away into a kind of medium-high tuning range, and we're going to get a lot more snap, a little bit less ring. Let's hear it. Same tuning with a gel just to check it out. So really, there we have it. There's my approach to the fundamentals of snare drum tuning. Now I know it does take a little time to get these things sounding right sometimes, and occasionally you just get the wrong combination of heads and drums, and it can be a real pain and give you a lot of grief. But I think ultimately it's so valuable to spend that time and just play drums that sound good. Because they're so much more enjoyable to play when you put a good idea on the kit and they sing back at you. I just really love sitting behind a kit and sometimes just playing one drum, and it just sounds so sweet. And just when they sound great, they inspire you to play better, and there's no more valuable way to spend your time than just sitting behind a kit that sings back at you. Now, I hope some of these tuning tips and tricks have been really useful for you guys, especially if you're having problems with your snare and this gets your snare sounding that bit closer to what you wanted, to the sound in your head that we're all aiming for. Now, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to check out more kit maintenance and drum lessons like this, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we hope to see you again soon.